Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Happy Friday edition of the Water Right Change Petition Hearing for the California WaterFix Project. I am Tam Dodek. To my right is Board Chair and Co-Hearing Officer Felicia Marcus. I believe we'll be joined shortly by Board Member Didi Damo. To my left are Dana Heinrich, Connie Mittenhofer, and Carl Oshindusco. We're also being assisted today by Mr. Hunt and Mr. Long. It is Friday, so does anyone here need for me to go over the emergency evacuation instructions? Does anyone need for me to go over the speak into the microphone instructions? All right.
How about these instructions?
That one I never skip because there's always a violator, Mr. Herrick, along the way. Please take a moment right now and put all your noise-making devices, machinery or person, on vibrate, silent, does not disturb. Please take a moment right now and check to make sure it is that way, even though you may think it is. All right. With that, before we continue with Mr. Herrick and his second rebuttal witness, just a quick housekeeping matter for next week. I want to just lay out the tentative schedule for all of us to keep in mind as we proceed. A couple of scheduling conflict has arisen for us, as well as I've heard some rumblings about requests to leave early Friday for the holiday weekend. So this is my anticipated schedule for next week. On Tuesday and Wednesday, we will begin at 9:30 and adjourn no later than 4 p.m. On Thursday, we will begin at 1 p.m. and adjourn no later than 5 p.m. On Thursday, we will begin at 9:30 a.m. We will go without a lunch break, but we will adjourn no later than 1 p.m. on Friday.
Thursday twice.
I'm sorry, did I say Thursday twice?
I meant Friday.
I meant Friday. Friday start at 9:30 and go through lunch and adjourn no later than 1 p.m. Thursday, begin at 1 p.m., adjourn no later than 5. Tuesday and Wednesday, begin at 9:30 a.m. and adjourn no later than 4 p.m. Any questions, objections? Good. All right, any other housekeeping matter anyone need to raise? All right, at the end of today, we'll go over the list of upcoming witnesses and see if we can map out next week so that people know who to expect. With that, Mr. Herrick.
Thank you. John Herrick for South Delta Parties. Thank you, Madam Chairs, board member, and staff. This is our second witness, Mr. Chip Salmon. He's already been sworn in. And just as a brief intro to put things in perspective, our witness yesterday, Mr. Burke, addressed the issue of the petitioner's case in chief regarding effects of the California WaterFix on stage or water levels. And he provided the technical aspect of what the modeling may or may not show with regard to those effects. And Mr. Salmon's testimony is follow on from that, and also rebutting the conclusions made originally by petitioner's witnesses that the effects of the water levels were small and would not constitute any significant impact. So Mr. Salmon's testimony is with regard to that. With that, Mr. Salmon, would you please introduce yourself, give your full name?
My full name is William Chip Salmon.
And you have in front of you South Delta et al. Exhibit number 260, do you?
Correct.
And is that a true and correct copy of your rebuttal testimony for this proceeding?
It is.
Now, instead of having Mr. Salmon summarize, I just thought I'd ask him 4 questions, and he can answer as he sees fit, and then we'll be done with his case in chief, or his presentation, so there's no
Before you
delay
do, though, Mr. Herrick,
Yes,
please confirm that Mr. Salmon has taken the oath.
Yes, Mr. Salmon has taken the oath. He appeared in Part 1B as a witness also. Mr. Salmon, your testimony, among other things, is meant to provide information indicating the problems currently experienced by you and others with regard to water levels or depth in the South Delta. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And as part of your testimony and cited in other people's testimony, there are 3 photographs taken Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And you did take those photographs, correct?
I most certainly did. That and many more.
Secondly, Mr. Salmon, your testimony confirms that irrigation for agricultural purposes in the South Delta occurs during, or can occur during all months of the year and not just in a particular season. Is that correct?
Correct. Even though I'm a diversified farmer, but even if I wasn't, that would still be the case, that the irrigation could continue throughout the year, all 12 months.
And Mr. Salmon, your testimony also raises the issue that a head of Old River barrier, if it might exacerbate water levels downstream of it, that would adversely affect you and others. Is that correct?
Correct. I'm at the very front of it, so yes, I would feel the effect much sooner than anyone else.
And finally, Mr. Salmon, your testimony provides evidence with regards to how even small changes in water level or depth might adversely affect a diverter in the area, correct?
Correct.
I think that's sufficient for a summary of his testimony, so we're ready, willing, and able for any cross.
Thank you, Mr. Herrick. As of yesterday, I only have cross by the Department of Water Resources.
Good morning, Robin McGinnis for Department of Water Resources. We reviewed the transcript from yesterday and actually don't have any questions for Mr. Salmon.
All right. Anyone else wishing to cross Mr. Salmon? Well, thank you for coming and wearing such a lovely tie.
Thank you.
It is? Yes.
A great color.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Herrick, at this time, do you wish to move your exhibits into the record?
Yes, pardon me. At this time, the exhibits that we presented for our rebuttal case are South Delta et al. Exhibit 257, which is the technical report prepared by Mr. Burke. South Delta Exhibit 258, which is the PowerPoint associated with his testimony and technical report. South Delta 259, which is the written summary for Mr. Burke's testimony. And South Delta Exhibit 260, which is the Chip Salmon testimony. So with that, I'd like to move those into evidence.
Thank you. I don't believe there are any outstanding objections, and not seeing any now. We have accepted those into the record. Thank you, Mr. Herrick. Thank you, Mr. Salmon.
Thank you,
And
Madam
thank you
Chair.
to Mr. Ruiz, who is not here, and Mr. Burke.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Meserve. Please.
Good morning. OSHA Meserve for Land and Group 19. And sitting with me here today, I have Jennifer Spalletta, specially appearing.
Good morning.
Good morning. Do you have an opening statement?
No, I don't have anything opening. This is in rebutting to the materials that were presented in DWR's case in chief. I have Mr. Ringelberg back here today to discuss the figures that...
Ms. Meserve, please bring the microphone closer to you.
Yes. To discuss the figures that Land is submitting with his testimony today. And in addition, Dr. Leinfelder-Miles is here to discuss, to rebut some of the statements in DWR's case in chief regarding the impact of salinity on plants and soils in particular. So if it is all right, I'll just go ahead and move into the testimony.
And before you do, could you confirm for the record that both witnesses have taken the oath?
Yes, they have.
Thank you.
So starting with you, Mr. Ringelberg, is Land 80 a true and correct copy of your testimony?
Yes, it is.
And I'm going to list a few exhibits here: Land 4, Land 5, Land 6, Land 7, Land 58, Land 57, and Land 60, true and correct copies of the figures that are being submitted with your testimony.
Yes, that is correct.
And Mr. Engelberg, if you could go ahead and proceed with your summary of testimony.
Sure. Madam Hearing Officer and fellow officers, thank you very much for allowing me to speak. So the information in Land 3, Land 4, Land 5, Land 6, Land 7, Land 57, Land 58, and Land 60 is reliable and is prepared according to the normal standards of care applicable to the development of such materials.
And then we will move to Dr. Leinfelder-Miles. Dr. Leinfelder-Miles.
Hold on, Ms. Meserve, before you do, I believe Mr. Berliner and Ms. Morris. Oh, Mr. Berliner has something to say.
Good morning. Tom Berliner on behalf of the Department of Water Resources. We have some objections to Dr. Leinfelder-Miles' testimony. There are two sets of objections. The first set of objections refers to the references in her testimony of the water rights of various witnesses or protestants that Land et al. Has sought to introduce into this proceeding. First of all, they are not rebuttal. This was, as far as we can tell, a procedural mistake by Land regarding the submittal of evidence that they are seeking to correct by using rebuttal testimony. Dr. Leinfelder-Miles refers to the protests that were filed on the basis that she used the maps that are in those protests as identification of land where she may have conducted some studies. As to the maps themselves, to the extent that she can establish that she actually used those maps in order to locate where she was going to conduct those studies, or that those maps are an accurate representation of exactly where she conducted those studies, we don't have an objection to the map itself. However, as to the remainder of the protest, those are irrelevant to any aspect of her testimony, and we would object to those. If she cannot identify why those maps were used, or that she perhaps chose her locations prior to those maps even being referenced in this proceeding, we object to them coming in.
What is the
Second-
specific
Hold on.
page number that you're referencing in line, please?
I am referring in her testimony to page 2, commencing at line 14 through 18.
Thank you, Ms. Meserve, for asking for that.
These would be land exhibits 51, 52, 54, 55.
I don't see those referenced
Oh, and
here.
53, sorry.
I'm sorry. Those aren't referenced in what you've just provided.
I'm sorry, what?
Look, the land exhibits which you've just referenced are not being submitted with this testimony, nor are they referenced on page 2.
They're not listed as Part 1 rebuttal exhibits from Land.
These would be the water rights of Bogle. Well, let's use it by name. These would be the water rights of Bogle, the Diablo water rights, the Elliott Stillwater water rights.
Might you be referring to land 75, 76, and 77?
Well, we have numbers that correspond to that, but I may be mistaken, but we also have other numbers that I mentioned, the ones at 51 through 55, so I'll just defer to the names rather than the exhibit numbers. These are the protests that were filed, or that they're attempting to introduce into evidence.
So we'll refer to them for now as land 75, 76, and 77, because that's how they're listed.
That'll be fine, and I'll try to figure out and get back to you why we have a different, same names and with a different set of numbers. And I'll try to clarify that for the record.
Please do. Any response, Ms. Meserve? Or Ms. Valletta?
I think the problem is we're not quite clear on what the basis of the objection is. He's saying that it's not relevant because she didn't rely on it. Is that the objection?
There's two. This is not rebuttal testimony, and this is the rebuttal phase. It's not rebutting anything. These are documents that should have been submitted as part of the case in chief, and they were not. And this is an attempt to try to clean up that mistake at this point, so it's improper. And the other is the documents in the main are not relevant to her testimony. It may be that the maps themselves are relevant, but that's yet to be established. She references these rights in passing in her testimony.
Ms. Valletta?
Thank you very much. If you read the testimony that is being objected to, what the witness has done is say that she is rebutting the testimony of petitioner's witnesses regarding the impact of salinity on crops as a result of the project. And in order to provide that rebuttal testimony, she has had to describe some background information about how she, as a professional in this field, would go about making that determination. And in order to do that, she has described specifically on page 2 that if she were asked to evaluate water salinity impacts, she would take the following steps. The first is she would look at the location of the diversions. And in order to describe how she would determine the location of the diversions, she has simply cited to the water right information of particular landowners who are near the locations of the new intakes. So this is simply demonstratively used to show that she as a professional would take the following steps, and she has pointed to the information in the record that she would have used and is now saying that petitioners should have used to conduct this analysis.
Thank you, Ms. Valletta. Any response to that you wish us to consider, Mr. Berliner?
Yes, please. I think Ms. Valletta makes the point that the research that Dr. Leinfelder-Miles was doing has nothing to do with the substance of the protests that were submitted by these growers, that she would identify areas where she wanted to conduct her investigations. So to the extent that the maps in the protest might be relevant, it has absolutely nothing to do with the basis of the protests that are filed by these particular landowners. She was conducting a scientific study of salt tolerance of alfalfa and was looking for various places to conduct that study. It has nothing to do with let's say, the text, if you will, of the protest. It has to do with a particular location in the Delta. So to the extent that the maps help with that particular location, that's fine. That's a useful piece of information. However, it has nothing to do with the actual protests that are being submitted by those parties.
Ms. Akoy, do you wish to join in or provide any further comment?
I'd like to join in, and also on behalf of the San Luis and Delta Mendota Water Authority, and I think I can offer some clarification regarding the numbering.
Yes, and perhaps you might want to use a different microphone so you don't have to give me imaginary back pain.
Okay. My recollection is that during the first phase, The protests are listed on the land exhibits as 50, whatever the numbers that Mr. Berliner said, but they weren't actually submitted. They were referenced in material. I believe that I did cross-examination during part 1 and highlighted the fact that no evidence of the water rights was in the record. They have now, in these new exhibits, put the protests as rebuttal exhibits, and for the reasons that Mr. Berliner has stated, I would agree that they are not actually rebuttal and shouldn't be accepted as exhibits.
All right, Ms. Morris, do you wish to add?
Yes, I will join for the state water contractors and just note in response to some of the comments made by Ms. Spalletta that these maps, protests don't actually identify where the studies that were done, not that, I'm not saying she was implying that, but to the extent it was implied, these maps are where landowners' property is located and not where the location of Dr. Leinfelder Miles studies were done.
All right. Final comments before we take this under consideration. Ms.
Yes,
Spalletta.
I think it would be appropriate, since the witness is here, for her to explain what that reference in her testimony meant with respect to her testimony, because it seems to be that the petitioners are complaining that because the land parties filed information regarding their water rights with their protests, which is part of the administrative record already, that they somehow then had to move those into evidence in the case in chief in order for an expert witness to rely on a map, which is a very, very odd argument. So I think we should just simply allow the witness to summarize her testimony, and then on this particular point, have her explain exactly what the reference to the maps was and how it relates to what she's put in her testimony.
All right.
If I could just add one thing, sorry, back to the ruling on February 21st, 2017, regarding foundation and these types of things, I believe made clear that if evidence is helpful and reliable, that it can be submitted, and if it helps explain background. And so I believe having the full protest in addition to the map, which is an attachment to it, is helpful in background to support the rebuttal testimony, which is showing that, you know, there are specific locations that could have been considered. I don't think it would be necessary that there's a specific connection between this particular witness and which areas she selected to study, one of which overlaps, and all of the locations shown in the maps or discussed in the protests. That is a far higher bar than any other evidence has been held to thus far in the proceeding.
All right. Since this seems to be a little bit more confusing than I first thought, I would like Mr. Berliner for the department to submit your objection in writing by 9:30 on Monday. And Ms. Meserve, Ms. Spalletta, you will have till 9:30 on Tuesday to provide a written response.
Thank you.
And you had a second objection. Let's
Yes.
hear it, and we may add that to the written as well.
You are going to. I have no doubt. This one's worse.
Oh, okay.
This one is
Mr. Berliner, give us a heads up, please.
This is a little bit more complex. So this concerns the report that Dr. Leinfelder Miles is seeking to introduce at this point as rebuttal testimony. This report was actually, interestingly, not submitted by Land in their case in chief. In fact, the report, the prior version of this report, actually two prior versions of the report, were submitted by the South Delta Water Agency, which is, I think, evidence in and of itself that Dr. Leinfelder Miles was not intending to rely on that report for her testimony, and that Land was not seeking to introduce that report as part of their case. Since that time, Dr. Leinfelder Miles has revised her report. She's added some text. We have a compare version of the report that we can provide to you now that shows the differences in the text. And what you will see is that there is text that's added, and for the benefit of people that would be looking at the compare version, as is typical in a redlined version of a document, the redlined or new parts or changed parts are in red. There are some tables in green. Green means in the compare that was a table that was moved from one location to another, but it's not new information. And then there's tables that are in black, which means they were original text and were not moved or otherwise adjusted in any way. What you will see is that there are no substantive changes to this report. This report is not rebuttal testimony. In my view, this is improvements to the report in terms of its language, making it a little bit fuller. Perhaps Dr. Leinfelder-Miles is going to submit this for publication somewhere and wants to make it upgrade the document, if you will. But the changes were irrelevant to her testimony. She really doesn't even discuss the report in her testimony. The report's not necessary for her to make the points in her testimony. Her testimony in the direct, as well as in today's rebuttal, really doesn't refer to her reports. And in our view, this is just an attempt on rebuttal to get in a report that, had it been available for direct, they would have tried to get it in direct, and it's questionable as to whether it adds anything to the case at all. And on that basis, we would move that it not be admitted into evidence.
And
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Mr. Berliner, the document that was passed out, and you keep on referencing the report, we're talking about land 79, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
No,
Thank
that's
you very
actually incorrect. What was handed out was a track change document that's not being introduced as evidence, but rather to demonstrate the kinds of changes that were made between what has been marked and previously moved into evidence as SDWA 140, which is the leaching fractions achieved in South Delta soils under alfalfa culture project report update August 2016. And what has been now referenced in Dr. Leinfelder-Miles' testimony as land 79 and is a December version of that testimony. And state water contractors would like to join in this motion, and I would just again note that looking at land 78, which is Dr. Leinfelder-Miles' testimony, the report is only referenced or cited in two places on page 3 of that document, one at line 8, which just references the project report and its identification. And it's solely for the purpose of, quote, describe how sampling methods should vary based on drip, sprinkler, and flood irrigation programs. And then again on line 15, which just again says it describes the methodology for the border check flood irrigated alfalfa fields, drip irrigated vineyard, and a sprinkler irrigated pear orchard. So the point of sort of pointing to those two sections is this report has significant changes that don't appear to have anything to do with the citations in this report, and it's going to cause us to have to do a lot of cross-examination on other aspects of this report that have been changed, and it's an inefficient use of time. If in fact, if I'm correct that these two sites are the only point that Dr. Leinfelder-Miles is making, it should refer probably back to the other document, SDWA 140.
Anyone else wish to join in on that motion, which, Mr. Berliner, you will also include in your written submission due on Monday, along with the comparison document that Ms. Morris just handed out? Ms. Belletta.
Thank you. Because you have asked for the objection to be in writing, we will respond in writing, but we'll simply note here that it appears that the objection is not on a specific evidentiary ground. It's just that petitioners think that the information is not particularly helpful to the hearing officers, is what I heard, but I think that's a decision the hearing officers can make for themselves, so we will respond in writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Belletta. Mr. Berliner.
Just to clarify, it's not rebuttal testimony is our objection.
All right, so noted. We'll take it under advisement. We look forward to reading your written submissions and from anyone else who wishes to join in. Just keep in mind the deadline of Tuesday, 9:30. All right, after all that excitement, Mr. Bellino.
You wanted ours by Monday at 9:30, correct?
Yes, and then Ms. Meserve, Ms. Valletta, and anyone else who wishes to comment will have until Tuesday, 9:30.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you. Shall I proceed?
You should, and if you, as Ms. Valletta suggested, wanted to direct Dr. Leinfelder-Miles to incorporate any of that helpful information that she might provide into her testimony today, you may want to direct her to do so as well, and we will take it under consideration.
Thank you. Dr. Leinfelder-Miles, is Land 78 a true and correct copy of your testimony?
Yes, it is.
And is Land 79 a true and correct copy of your December 16th alfalfa project update?
Yes, it is.
I haven't conferred with the witness on this particular issue, but if you wish to, do you wish to further explain the references at this time, or?
You do not have to, since you will have an opportunity to submit
It's
it
not
in writing.
necessary.
Then I'll wait to do anything at this time.
Okay.
You're going to make me wait until Tuesday to...
Okay, that's fine. If you could go ahead and proceed with your summary of testimony, please.
Okay, thank you. My name is Michelle Leinfelder-Miles, and I'm the Delta Crops Resource Management Advisor with UC Cooperative Extension, based in San Joaquin County and serving the 5-county Delta region. I've been in this position for 5 years, and I have 14 years of experience working in agricultural cropping systems research. I received my bachelor's in crop science and management from UC Davis, and my master's and PhD in horticulture from Cornell University. The major roles of a UC Cooperative Extension farm advisor are to conduct applied research and extend the findings of research to the local community. We are based in the counties that we serve, not on a campus. My research program is directed toward crop production and soil and water resource management. I conduct research projects in cooperation with Delta growers on their farms in order to gain an understanding of how scientific principles apply in the field. To expand our understanding of science in the field and accomplish the goal of extending new knowledge requires mutual respect and trust between the farm advisor and the growers. The petitioner's case in chief concluded that the proposed change would not injure legal water users in the Delta, and furthermore that submitted testimony and documents provided evidence to this. In my role as farm advisor, I have dedicated considerable time to assessing soil salinity conditions in the Delta because salinity has the potential to impact crop productivity and soil resource management. My projects were developed in order to understand baseline salinity conditions and how irrigation water salinity and soil salinity change over time. I'd like to make a correction to Mr. Berliner's statement in that my alfalfa project was not a study of crop salinity tolerance. It was to understand how soil salinity and water salinity change over time. My testimony outlines the kind of research that would be required to evaluate whether water salinity is affecting soil salinity and thus has the potential to impact yield. In a scenario where asked to evaluate how water salinity may impact soil salinity and crop yield, I would identify soil sampling locations with the following criteria in mind. First, I would consider water quality. I would select locations with different water sources and then sample water as it is being applied to fields, or at least from points of diversion onto Delta islands of interest. Maps of points of diversion have been submitted by protestants, and those are key in helping me to understand where water is sourced from on these farms. I want to emphasize the importance of sampling water as it is applied to a field and from as many irrigations as possible during the growing season in order to characterize what quality of water is available to the crop and how water quality changes over the season. A witness for the petitioners has testified that individual diversions were not considered in the assessment of how the project may impact Delta water users. Additionally, monthly or yearly averages of surface water salinity should not be used as a substitute for applied water salinity to a field. I would also consider soil series, cropping patterns, and crop salinity tolerance and irrigation systems in my evaluations. For soil series, I would sample soils that are representative of large areas of the Delta. This type of information, soil series and soil characteristics, is available online, and I've cited to the website in my written testimony. Cropping patterns and crop salinity tolerance. I would select sites having typical crops for the region. Crop acreage is available from county agricultural commissioners' offices, but keep in mind that these data are for the entire county and must be parsed out for the Delta. Finally, I would select sites keeping the irrigation system in mind because sampling will vary based on the wetting pattern of the irrigation system. Some final thoughts on evaluating salinity in Delta agricultural systems. Irrigation water carries salts, and salts may accumulate in the soil at higher concentrations than what existed in the water due to evaporation and crop water uptake. Salts may accumulate disproportionately in the soil, and thus soil sampling must be thorough enough to characterize the salt distribution. Now I want to characterize salinity impacts to Delta agricultural systems. I define impacts as decreases in crop yield or degrading of soil which requires changes in management or affects future cropping. Increases in applied water salinity may impact Delta agricultural systems in both of these ways. Yields reported by county agricultural commissioners will not accurately reflect yields for the Delta because crop reports aggregate data for the entire county. To understand how increases in salinity have the potential to impact yield, we can observe yield potential equations, which I have submitted for alfalfa and grapes in Exhibit A. I don't know if it's possible to pull up Land 78, Exhibit A. So there are two graphs here. The top graph illustrates the threshold for soil salinity at which grapes would we would expect to see yield impacts to grapes. That's the top graph. And what that shows is that until a soil salinity threshold of 1.5 decisiemens per meter, we would expect to see no decreases in yield potential. Hence, we would have a even yield potential at 100% until 1.5 decisiemens per meter. At that point, we would expect to see yield declines at a linearly decline using that equation. I may have actually misspoken. I apologize. The top figure is for alfalfa and the bottom one's for grapes. I can't see very well from this distance. No, thank you. So the top one is for alfalfa. For that one, the threshold is 2.0 decisiemens per meter. Beyond 2.0, we would expect to see yield declines at roughly 7% per increase, 1.0 increase in EC. The bottom figure represents grapes, and that would be a threshold of 1.5, and then a linear decrease of 9% per increase of 1.0 EC. While absolute tolerances such as these may vary depending on conditions, these numbers serve as a guide for understanding how salinity impacts crop yields. In cross-examination, one of the petitioner's witnesses stated that a change in water quality that is less than 5% is not an impact. This statement flies in the face of scientific literature. Even a small change in water salinity could reduce yield if that change resulted in soil salinity that exceeded the crop tolerance threshold. Additionally, if a grower must change practices to adapt to increases in water salinity in order to prevent reaching the soil salinity threshold, then the cost associated with those changes is also an impact. I have heard the argument that growers should grow salt-tolerant crops or plant varieties with higher salt tolerance in response to higher salinity conditions. But my response to that is the choice of what to grow is an economic decision that takes many factors into account, and plant breeding is not a substitute for soil salinity management. For all of these reasons, it is inaccurate to conclude that Delta agricultural systems would not be impacted by changes in water quality that the petitioners characterize as small. To conclude, my applied research experiences have shown me the complexity of managing salinity in Delta agricultural systems. I have outlined the kind of research that would be required to conclude no impact to Delta agricultural water users, where impact could be decreases in crop yield or degradation of soil, which requires changes in management or affects future cropping. The petitioners disregarded individual diversions and assumed, quote unquote, small changes to water quality would not have impacts. For these reasons, the analysis presented by the petitioners is inadequate to conclude no impact to Delta agricultural water users. Thank you.
This concludes our direct testimony.
Thank you very much. Let's see. As of yesterday, I had 3 parties wishing to conduct cross-examination of this panel. Department of Water Resources for 45 minutes, Ms. Morris for about 10, and Mr. Herrick for about 20. Is there anyone else wishing to conduct cross-examination? All right. Then we'll turn to the Department of Water Resources. And assuming that your 45-minute estimate is correct, we will take our morning break, Candace, at the completion of their cross-examination. Oh, does that mean? Have we not been webcasting?
We actually did hear from somebody that they couldn't.
Oh, now
see
it's
it.
on. You mean that fantastic exchange of objections and responses was not aired? Let's do it again.
Nah, let's call it.
Mr. Berliner.
Are we okay to start?
Yes.
Thank you.
Is the 45-minute estimate still somewhat good?
I think so.
Okay. And your topics?
Essentially, I'm going to be following the outline that Dr. Leinfelder-Miles just presented regarding, for instance, her locations where studies were done, salt tolerance on the crops, varieties of alfalfa, a little bit about the leaching factor, and root depth, root zone, and root depth. That's it.
All right. Nothing from Mr. Ringelberg.
No.
All right. Please proceed.
Thank you. Good morning. Tom Berliner on behalf of the Department of Water Resources. I'm assisted this morning by Ms. Robin McGinnis, also of the Department of Water Resources. Good morning, Dr. Leinfelder-Miles. Thank you for coming today. In your testimony, you indicated that in doing your research, one of the things you have to do is find out where or decide where you want to conduct your research. As I understand it, you look for locations by going online and finding areas where the land is representative of large parts of the Delta. Is that a correct paraphrase?
I would say the soil is representative of large areas of the Delta.
Okay. Thank you. And once you've located these areas, how do you actually go about gaining access to the land? Do you, for example, speak to the growers, or do you just go on the land? If you could just describe what you do.
Yeah, I identified the soil series that were of interest to me, and then through working relationships that I've already established with the local community, I asked for permission to conduct the study of the growers.
And do you call them up and say, I'd like to come out and work on your land? Is that a typical approach?
Yeah.
And you explain to them what you're going to do on the property? Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
And then how do you memorialize what you've done? In other words, which land you've gone on, where you've conducted the study. Do you have records on that?
Yes.
And what do those records denote? Is it a GPS system, or how do you indicate where you're actually conducting your analysis?
Yeah, I use GPS sometimes. Sometimes I just measure.
And what do you measure?
I measure distances.
From some landmark?
Mm-hmm.
And then you record in your records, I was at the Jones property, I was, 100 feet from the intersection of a road, and this is where I did my analysis. Is it something like that?
Something like that.
Okay, great, thank you. Now, is it correct that there's research being done regarding the salt tolerance of various kinds of alfalfa?
There is research that's looking at salt tolerance of alfalfa.
And do you participate in that research?
I'm not a participant on that project.
Have you participated in the past?
No, I have not.
Do you keep up to speed on the research that's being done?
Yes, I do.
And do you discuss that with farmers in the area where you work?
Yes.
And do those farmers sometimes change the kinds of crop that they're growing to adjust, if salt is an issue, to adjust to a more salt-tolerant crop?
I have described in my testimony that the choice of what crops that growers are growing is an economic decision that takes many factors into account.
Okay, and economics is one. Is salt another?
I would say salt is part of an economic decision. A grower has to make ends meet. And so the grower is taking into account agronomy, soil science, irrigation, and all of this goes into an economic decision of what's going to yield and make money.
Okay, and as part of this consideration by the farmer, if a more salt-tolerant variety would produce more crop, would that be a relevant consideration?
Excuse me, incomplete hypothetical.
It's just one factor that she identified, and I'm just trying to get a better idea.
Overruled. Okay, so alfalfa varieties, since you've named alfalfa, let's talk about alfalfa varieties. The research that has been referenced refers to alfalfa varieties that are non-dormant alfalfa varieties. These are the varieties that have been tested for salt tolerance. And these varieties are not appropriate for the Delta. We do not grow non-dormant alfalfa varieties in the Delta. So even the results of that research won't be applicable to Delta growers. Secondly, alfalfa is not rotated on a yearly basis. So even if we were to learn that there are alfalfa varieties that are more salt tolerant, it's not a decision that a grower can make quickly without losing the investment that that grower has already put into the alfalfa crop.
So what variety of alfalfa are grown in the Delta?
Varieties that are non-dormant, we have dormancy scaled on a scale of 1 to 10. Generally, growers in the Delta are growing dormancy, fall dormancy 5s through 7s. The dormancies that have been tested in the San Joaquin Valley, the southern San Joaquin Valley, have been 8s, 9s, and maybe 10s. These are considered non-dormant varieties.
And do you know what varieties were used on the lands that you studied?
I do not. Let's also be clear that the dormancy rating is not the variety. So we're a little bit talking apples and oranges, but to be clear, the varieties that were tested in the southern San Joaquin Valley for salt tolerance are non-dormant varieties.
What is the range of the salinity threshold for the various alfalfa crops that are grown in the Delta?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I've presented the salt tolerance for alfalfa in Exhibit A. For alfalfa, we would expect to see yield declines at approximately 2.0 decisiemens per meter, and then we would expect to see a 7% decline in yield potential for every increase of 1 decisiemen per meter in salinity, soil salinity.
Do you know if there are growers in the south part of the Delta that plant any alfalfa varieties that have a higher salinity tolerance than 2.0 decisiemens?
I do not know, but I also know that there is no current research looking at that salt tolerance threshold. There is no current research that would change that salt tolerance threshold.
Would farmers be able to figure that out for themselves?
No,
Not through experience?
no. That threshold was developed through scientific research, years of research. And that's not an experiential threshold that was set. That was a scientific approach to establishing a threshold.
You mentioned that there was some testimony by one of the witnesses that a 5% increase in salinity could change the crop's tolerance to the salt uptake. Is that correct?
Misstates prior testimony.
I'm not trying to
That's
be
also
exact.
not what I heard, Ms. Dr. Leinfelder-Mouse.
What I said in my testimony is that if a change in water salinity, as small as it may be, were to result in a change in soil conditions that moved the soil salinity to be higher than the threshold, then we would expect to see yield declines.
And what if it doesn't move it above the threshold?
Then we wouldn't expect to see yield declines.
So a 5% increase at water quality of 1.0 to 1.05 would not then result in a decrease. Is that correct?
No, that's not at all what I'm
Objection,
saying.
Vague. It's not clear what he's talking about now.
I'm
Is it water quality or soil salinity?
talking about water quality.
I will say again, in my testimony, I stated that a change in water quality, regardless of how large or small it may be, if it results in a change in soil salinity that exceeds the threshold, the salt tolerance threshold for a crop, then we would expect to see yield declines.
Does the application of saltier water on a particular occasion necessarily change the soil salinity?
It can.
But does it?
It's a hypothetical question, and so I answer hypothetically, it can.
I'm going to ask you about the leaching formula. Is it true that the leaching formula that you use defines the leaching fraction as the salinity of the water applied at the surface of the ground divided by the soil salinity at the bottom of the root zone?
The leaching fraction equation is the salinity of the water applied to the soil water salinity at the base of the root zone.
So is it fair to say that the soil salinity at the bottom of the root zone, or I guess you could say the root zone depth, is an important component of that formula?
The base of the root zone, yes. The soil salinity at the base of the root zone is a component of that equation, yes.
And by the base of the root zone, we are talking about where the roots of the plant stop growing. Is that accurate?
The scientific literature would define the base of the root zone as the area of soil where the soil salinity is highest. And previous research has shown that crop roots do not grow into that zone. So yes, it would be the base of the root zone.
Did you use the Ayers and Westcott approach in determining your leaching fraction?
Yes.
And did you apply their definition of root zone in your work?
Yes.
What is the rooting depth of alfalfa? Does it vary?
It can vary.
And what's the range, do you know?
I don't know the range. It will depend on conditions. Previous research has shown that when soil salinity reaches its maximum, that alfalfa roots are not growing into that depth. And that research showed that it was a study in the Imperial Valley. The soil salinity reached its maximum between 3 and 4 feet, and roots were not found below 3 feet. Crops will be finding water in an area where the water is best. They won't be growing into an area of the soil where the soil is not conducive to good growth.
And if there was good water, let's say at 6 feet, might the roots go that deep?
Not if water was plentiful at the surface, which in an irrigated system, water would be plentiful to establish a good root system in the top few feet.
In the work that you were doing, did you have some fields that had leaching fractions in the 20% range?
Yes.
Were these fields restricted in rooting depth?
No, I would say not.
So there can be, I take it then, variation depending on conditions as to the depth of the root zone. Is that right?
Yes, I said that previously.
Did you, in your work, measure the presence or absence of roots at different depths?
I did not measure it, but I did not observe roots at soil levels deeper than, 3 or 4 feet. Observationally, those are the only remarks I can make. I didn't make measurements.
Was there a particular reason you didn't make measurements?
Because roots can be difficult to find.
You were drilling down in the ground, correct?
Yes,
And you use an auger to do that?
yes,
So you can't actually see down to the bottom of the hole, right, correct?
that's correct.
So if you wanted to find root zone depth, you'd have to actually excavate, correct?
Correct.
And that would involve a much larger hole than what an auger would make, correct?
Yes.
Have you conducted that type of study?
No. Keeping in mind that I'm working with growers. I'm not on a campus. I work directly with growers, and I wouldn't dare ask a grower to take an excavator to his field.
Are you aware that they do that in other places in the Central Valley?
I'm not aware of that being done on any growers' fields.
Are you aware of the almond root zone studies that are being done in the San Joaquin Valley by some of your colleagues?
I do not work in almonds. I would point out, though, that in an
I don't
almond
think there's
orchard,
I don't think there's a question pending.
okay?
Actually, if you have something helpful to us to add.
I would just point out that in an almond orchard, you can easily get tractors in between the rows of trees. So to take an excavator into an orchard and dig a hole wouldn't probably impact the orchard that much and wouldn't have as much economic impact on a grower. But taking an excavator into an alfalfa field is going to have a lot more destruction, and therefore I haven't done that kind of research myself.
But that's just an opinion because you have not done any, or not familiar with any studies of almond.
That's correct.
In your most recent report update, you referred to a reference by Bally, is that correct?
Yes.
Did I pronounce that name right?
Yes, but are you talking about Land 79?
Yes.
Okay.
And as I understand it, I should probably clarify for you, there's no ruling yet by the Water Board on the admissibility of the, excuse me, on the, there's no ruling yet on the admissibility of the study, so we have to ask a few questions that may at some point become irrelevant, depending on the board's ruling.
Before we get into questions about this study, we did have DWR hand out the red line version, and I don't believe that it has been marked as an exhibit. Do you plan to refer to the red line?
No.
Okay.
Hold on, Ms. Morris.
Sorry, I'm going to ask this question to hope to solve some efficiency. I'm wondering if instead of getting into the details again of the entirety of changes in this report that actually doesn't change the data, if the petitioner of a protestants council would be willing to stipulate to only certain portions that are referenced in the actual testimony rather than the entirety of the report.
Ms. Meserve?
I believe that the citations that Dr. Leinfeld or Miles have made are adequate to support the update, which was meant to be helpful to the hearing to provide her most recent version of the report with them. And I believe in terms of the types of references that we've seen hundreds of in petitioners' submittals for rebuttal, that there's probably, more reliance on this particular document that we've seen on a lot of other documents referenced. So no,
Commentary aside, I take that was a no to Ms. Morris' request for stipulation.
yes.
Yes, no. Thank you for trying, Ms. Morris. With that, Mr. Berliner, please proceed with your questions.
Thank you. We were talking about the Bally report, Dr. Leinfelder Miles.
Yeah,
correct
and you're referring to the Bali 2001 study?
Yes.
Okay.
So is it accurate that they indicated that you should use the 30 centimeter increment in the highest salinity concentration as the depth of the root zone?
No, I didn't read the paper to say that.
What did you read it to say?
I read the paper to say that down to 36 inches, which would be approximately 90 centimeters, would be the depth of the root zone.
In your view, does the recommendation by Bally differ from the recommendation by Ayers and Westcott?
I don't know what recommendation you're referring to.
The use of the, well, you don't just agree with my characterization, so I'll just move on.
I don't know either to be providing specific recommendations.
So how did you calculate the leaching fraction?
I've specified that I calculated the leaching fraction as the electrical conductivity of the applied water divided by the electrical conductivity of the soil water.
Does salinity change at different depths?
Yes,
So it's not a static situation. As you go deeper or higher, it might change.
yes. And I've illustrated that in figure 2 of my report, which has not changed among the different versions.
Take it you're aware that this was a very wet year.
Yes,
Would that affect the depth of the salinity?
it could.
And might it affect the salinity concentration?
It could affect the salt concentration, yes.
Give me just a minute. Getting near the end. I want to go back to the application of irrigation water and soil salinity. Is there any rule of thumb as to the change in soil salinity in response to the application of irrigation water?
No, there's no rule of thumb because it will vary depending on conditions.
When one applies the irrigation water, does that change the soil salinity immediately?
Well, you are adding salts immediately with the irrigation water, and so yes, it would have an immediate effect on the soil salinity.
And that could be to either increase the soil salinity or decrease the soil salinity, correct?
If the water has some level of salts, then it would be increasing the salinity.
And when you're leaching the soil, the idea is to apply a volume of water with less salt in it, correct?
No, that's not correct. When you're leaching the soil, you are applying water in excess of crop evapotranspiration.
Such that the excess water would then leach the soil, correct?
Such that the excess soil would go below the base of the root zone and leach the salts.
The witness
excess
just said
water,
the excess soil. Did you mean excess water?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. We were discussing some protests earlier. I had made an objection to the submittal of some evidence, and I identified some landowners who had submitted protests in this case. Do you recall that exchange that we had, or not that you and I had earlier, but that I had with the board?
Regarding maps.
Correct, and protests that were submitted by some landowners.
I recall that there was an exchange. I'm not familiar with the protests of the landowners, with the specific language.
So you didn't rely on those protests in order to choose your locations for your work?
What work are we speaking about?
The soil examinations, the examinations of the root zones that you conducted.
Which project?
The project that you've reported in your testimony and in your report.
In my report, that was a project done in the South Delta. Those exhibits, those maps represent points of diversion in the North Delta, so they have no relationship to the project in the Alfalfa project.
And what relationship do they have to your testimony?
They relate to the testimony because in a situation where asked to evaluate how a change in surface water quality may change soil salinity, I would be interested in the points of diversion of water onto an island so that I would know, get a frame of reference for what that water quality might be. Using that information, I would then go on to sample the water as it's being applied to the field.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. How did you come to modify your report? I understand there's 3 different versions of it.
I updated references. I cited other studies in more detail. As part of a scientific paper, we would be showing our results and then referencing other studies that may have had similar results or differing results. We would use that scientific understanding from previous studies to explain what we found or otherwise come to conclusions on the project that we've done.
Will this report be published, do you know?
Yes, eventually. Do you mean peer-reviewed?
Yes.
Yeah, it will eventually be peer-reviewed and published.
Are you planning to do another revision of this report?
I will continue to revise this report even until peer reviewers have given me further provisions, further changes that they recommend. Until it is in a journal, it will continue to be reviewed. The data, however, will not change. I will be adding more data. I will be using precipitation data to further look at these sites. Mr. Berliner brought up precipitation. So yes, I will be looking at precipitation, and that has always been stated as an objective of the report in all 3 versions of the report that's been submitted.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Does that conclude DWR's cross-examination of this witness or the
Yes.
panel?
Yes, it does.
All right.
Thank you.
Ms. Morris. I promised you a break, but since Ms. Morris is only estimating 10 minutes, we'll power through.
Unless I made life more difficult.
Good morning, Stephanie Morris, State Water Contractors. I just have a few questions for you, Dr. Lyfounder-Miles, and I apologize. I hope you will tolerate my ignorant questions, but I will do my best to try to understand this difficult area. I did want to ask a couple follow-up questions. Earlier this morning, there was discussion about your testimony, Land 78 on page 2, and the location of certain maps in the protests, and there was a comment by Ms. Meserve that there were overlapping in your areas of study to some of the areas identified in your testimony on page 2. And I was wondering if you could please tell me which map and exhibit those are that was included in your study and what study it was.
I'm afraid I don't understand the question.
Okay, I'll break it into 2 parts. Do you recall the conversation that we had earlier this morning, and Ms. Meserve stated that some of the land that was looked at in one of your studies that was presented in your testimony was overlapping with some of the land that was that has been indicated and relied upon you on the maps on page 2 of your testimony. Do you recall that?
I recall that there was a conversation being had.
So you
I
don't
was not a
recall
participant in the conversation.
Ms. Morris, instead of trying to paraphrase what you believe Ms. Meserve said, I suggest you just ask her
I'm
the
trying.
question.
I'll try again. Let's do it this way. The land that you looked at in any of your studies that you've relied on in your reports that have been presented here, are any of those lands also lands that are protestants' lands that you have identified in your testimony on page 2 of land 78? Are any of them the same?
It may be helpful, this is Jennifer Spilletta, it may be helpful to actually put the maps up from those exhibits so that the witness can at least look at the maps and understand the locations that we're talking about instead of going from memory.
Let's do that. Ms.
Land
Morris, if you would help us out with
75?
exhibit number?
Sure. It's land 75, land 76, land 77. Just scroll down to the map locations. For the record, I'm sorry, is this land 75 that you've pulled up, Mr. Hunt? Land 76, thank you.
So why don't we just tackle them one at a time?
Sure. It might take me a little more than 10 minutes, but I'll be as fast as I can.
That's fine. Anything to frustrate Mr. O'Laughlin further is fine with me.
Okay, so
Would you please scroll out so we can see the entire map? Thanks.
So we're looking at the map in land 76. Was this, was any of the property identified, were these diversion points part of your study?
Yes.
And which lands were those?
My previous study was indicated in my case-in-chief testimony.
Yeah, but there's no maps. We asked you about this in detail, so I can't really go into it again, but you didn't identify the properties that you studied or the locations of the sample sites on those properties, did you?
Yes, I did.
You located it by GPS, the location of the sample sites,
I
and you
submitted
provided that
a
information.
Google Earth image of the sampling sites.
Objection vague. Can you please state, Ms. Morris, what study you're talking about?
I'm referring to any of the studies. There's been several that she's testified about in her report. I'm just trying to identify where could you just point me then to what exhibit in your previous testimony you identified the location of your studies and the sample locations in the fields?
II-18.
Could you please pull that up, Mr. Hunt? Okay, and could you point, are the stars the location of the sampling site?
Yes.
But there's no GPS location, right? I mean, this is just a map. You haven't provided the GPS data for that.
No, I have not provided the GPS data for that.
But you do have that information.
I do not have GPS identification for these sites, no.
Okay, let me go back. Earlier in your testimony, in your question...
Mr. Berliner was asking me about the alfalfa study, and that's what I have GPS location for.
Okay, and I'm asking about either the alfalfa study or the pear study. You have both in your testimony. So you said you have GPS data for the alfalfa sites then, and you have not provided that data.
That's correct.
And it's not part of your report.
That is correct.
And for the pear studies, what are the basis then, if you don't have GPS data, of the location of these stars?
Measurements.
And you have not provided that data in your report either.
That's not data. Those are measurements. Those are measurements to
I
indicate where I have
apologize. Let me
sampled.
rephrase
Hold
the
on.
question. You have not provided, and I'm a lawyer, so I could confuse inches. The other day, I did something I called inches feet, and I was an accident just because I don't think that well mathematically, which is probably why I'm a lawyer. So I apologize for saying data. I consider that a part of the information of your study. So have you provided the measurements of those survey locations or sampling locations in your report or any of your testimony?
I have described the sampling procedures in my written testimony in the case in chief.
But have not provided the measurements for where those sampling locations are, correct?
No, I have not, because in the pear study, I explicitly stated that it was a random sampling in that pear orchard. So I took samples randomly throughout the orchard, which I will point out, a prerequisite for an experiment is to randomly sample, not to sample specifically and then
Yes. I'm not
denote that
taking
specific sample.
Any issue with, I'm just trying to identify and understand where I can find that information and why it hasn't been provided. So I have no further questions at this point in time.
Thank you, Ms. Morris. Mr. Herrick?
For the record, I do want to, just again, pending the ruling, I do believe that there's significant new information in this report, Land 79, that hasn't been provided, and I want to reserve the right that I think I have to do SIR rebuttal, and I will be likely extensive SIR rebuttal because it hasn't been explained very well what new addition and why it was provided in her testimony.
So noted. Mr. Herrick, do you still wish to conduct cross-examination? Yes, but it won't be planned to be 4 minutes. All right, let's go ahead and bring you up. Then we will take a very long break before we get to Mr. O'Loughlin.
John Herrick for South Delta Parties. I just have 2 or 3 questions for Dr. Leinfeld and Miles. My first question, Doctor, is a hypothetical, and so please follow through with me. And the hypothetical is somebody proposes a project. That project needs regulatory approval. One of the criteria for regulatory approval is, I'll just say no injury. We're not going to use that as a legal term, but no harm to other water users. And as evidence of no harm, those project proponents present a bar chart that has the monthly averages for 16 years data presented so that you have the EC average of the water quality in the channels. And that's the evidence for whether or not there's harm to agricultural water users from the project. Does that allow any sort of scientific conclusion as to whether or not the project's potential changes adversely affect agricultural water users?
That sort of data would not give me any solace that there would be no injury to water users. And as stated in my rebuttal testimony, monthly averages are in a channel are meaningless. We have to know what's being applied to the field.
And that was my next question. The data with regard to the channel water, which is the applied water for the ag, the data to the channel water tells you nothing about the effects of the soil salinity of the crop or the agricultural land. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Moving on to, you were asked a question with regard to, or you mentioned in your testimony that there are these other varieties of alfalfa that may be more salt tolerant than some others, correct?
Yes.
Is there any accepted science that indicates your threshold chart or graph for alfalfa is any different between salt-sensitive crops and regular non-salt sensitive crops, I'll say?
No.
And lastly, You were asked about wet years and the soil salinity might change if it's a wet year or there's heavy rainfall. Do you remember that?
Yes.
In the Delta, a wet year might add water to the surface. It might provide leaching, but is it possible that that high flow year would also push salts up from the lower in the groundwater back into the root zone?
Yeah, it could. There could be a redistribution of salt in the root zone.
So it's not just as simple as saying, well, it was a wet year, so now there's no salt problem, correct?
Oh, correct. And I would also point out that, we're using wet year relatively. I've looked at the amount of precipitation that we had in the Delta. We have new CIMMIS stations in the Delta. The CIMMIS station that I looked at, the Holt CIMMIS station, said that we had roughly 18 inches. There was some missing data, so I pieced together some data from another CIMMIS station that was nearby. So anywhere from 18 to 20 inches this last year. While it would be nice to think that this year has solved all of our problems, I would argue that this year was an anomaly and that, even the Hoffman report has 50 some odd years of precipitation data, and the average of that precipitation over those 50 years was roughly 10 inches. So having 20 inches of rain this year doesn't solve our salinity problem when the average over the years has been roughly 10.
And lastly, South Delta was integral in getting those new CIMMIS stations approved for locations, right? Never mind. I have no further questions.
Move to strike.
That always happens when he
Yeah.
comes up.
Any redirect?
No.
All right. At this time, would you like to move your exhibits into the record, even though we will not be ruling on that because we're still awaiting the objections and responses?
Yes, I would. Would you like me to list them?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I would move land 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 57, 58, 60, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79, and 80 into the record, subject to the ruling by the hearing officers on the objections.
Thank you. And at this time, I'm also closing the window to any further objections with respect to your exhibits. With that, we will take a break, and we will return at 11:15 to group number 18 for their rebuttal, which I don't believe will take us too long. So if the court reporter is okay, we'll go through this and take a lunch. Well, we probably won't take a lunch break because we'll probably be adjourning after this. And so after Group 18 present their rebuttal and any cross-examination and redirect therefore, I'd like to also discuss next week's schedule in terms of the parties that might be up, any anticipated cross-examination, because there is a possibility that we might actually be done next week. And Ms. Womack, actually, I see that you're here. Would you like to present your rebuttal today? It's up to you. All right. Are you requesting to go? Is there any objection? Ms. Womack's is fairly short. Okay. We'll get to you as soon as we can on Tuesday or Wednesday. Got it? Okay, with that, we'll take our break, and we'll see you at 11:15. All right, it is 11:15. We are back in session for the much anticipated rebuttal testimony from Group 18.
Good morning. Tim O'Loughlin, representing San Joaquin Tributaries Authority. I told you during the break that Mr. Steiner has not taken the oath, so we should get that done first.
Please stand up and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth? If so, answer, yes, I do. Thank you.
My short opening statement is this. Modeling results and actually what occurs in reality are two different things. And what we want to have in the record moving forward is what the compliance has been with D1641 in regards to San Joaquin River flows, because that's going to play into our arguments about the basis for the board being able to set appropriate delta flow criteria at a later point in time in regards to WaterFix. So this rebuttal testimony is very narrow in scope. Mr. Steiner.
Before you begin, Mr. O'Loughlin.
Sure.
Ms. Offenberg.
Yes, Amy Offenberg with the Department of the Interior. We have an objection to this testimony based on two grounds, relevance and also being improper rebuttal. Mr. Steiner's rebuttal testimony states that it is intended to rebut DWR witness Mr. John Lehi's testimony regarding the State Water Project and Central Valley Project successful record of compliance with water quality objectives in the Bay Delta. Mr. Steiner's rebuttal is solely focused on Vernalis flow objectives under Table 3 of D1641. Mr. Lehi's testimony, however, makes clear that he is focused on real-time State Water Project CVP ops to meet Tables 1 and 2 of D1641. That's from Mr. Lehi's case-in-chief testimony, DWR 61, page 6, lines 4 through 6. Tables 1 and 2 of D1641 encompass water quality objectives for agricultural and municipal and industrial uses. To the extent Mr. Lehi discusses flow and operational objectives, his testimony was concerned only with the key objectives affecting the joint operations of State Water Project and CVP facilities, which does not include water quality or flow operational objectives at Vernalis. This was made clear in Mr. Lehi's presentation of results in DWR 401 and 402, which did not show exceedance charts for any Vernalis objective, as well as Mr. Lehi during presentation of his direct testimony and cross-examination. In fact, during cross-examination, Mr. O'Loughlin asked Mr. Milligan if Mr. Lehi had asked him to do a chart of compliance at Vernalis, to which Mr. Milligan simply responded no. Therefore, Mr. O'Loughlin has already established that Mr. Lehi's testimony regarding the successful record of compliance does not include Vernalis, and Mr. Steiner's testimony is fully duplicative and a waste of time. To the extent that Mr. O'Loughlin is attempting to make a larger point about the volume of water at Vernalis, we note that the San Joaquin Tributary Authority did not present any evidence for a case-in-chief and is prohibited from now attempting to submit a case-in-chief testimony during this rebuttal phase. In addition, to address more clearly the relevance objection, Ms. Kristen White, on behalf of Bureau of Reclamation, testified at least in 3 different occasions that the San Joaquin River inflows were modeled exactly the same between the no action and with Cal WaterFix.
Before you respond, Mr. O'Loughlin, Ms. McGinnis.
Robin McGinnis for California Department of Water Resources. DWR joins in the objection.
Now, Mr. O'Loughlin.
Tim O'Loughlin, San Joaquin Tributaries Authority. Well, this is all fascinating because basically in the testimony that was presented, and if I want, I'll do a whole written response to this. The SWP and the CVP operate in a coordinated operation agreement. This petition is being done jointly under a coordinated operation agreement that has an OCAP BO that is going to be part of a coordinated operation agreement, specifically
tied to this project. New Maloney's is part of the CVP. As you've heard many times before in these proceedings, the CVP is operated as an integrated system. So in regards to what water is appearing in the delta at what time and at what location and what place, it is very relevant to this proceeding to understand what those flows are. And the point that I'm trying to make here in regards to both Mr. Lehi's testimony and the testimony of the CVP, Ms. White, if you notice the wording was very specific. It said that they modeled it under the no action alternative as is the same as the California WaterFix as the proposed project. Our point is this: the no action alternative that they modeled is not a no action alternative because it doesn't represent reality. Reality is that D1641 has not been met since 1995 and is currently not being met and will not be met moving forward. And when you look at that equation about how much water is or isn't appearing in the delta under D1641, changes the inflow into the delta and the outflow to the delta, which changes all the other parameters in the delta. So our point is this: if you don't have the right numbers in the get-go, then your modeling assumptions are incorrect, and therefore your model differentials or your deltas are incorrect. So that's the point that's being made, and it's entirely relevant because at some point in time, this board is going to have to set appropriate delta flow criteria. And as part of the proceedings, what's been put forward so far by DWR, so DWR says basically, we're DWR, we don't have any facilities on the San Joaquin, so we're taking a hall pass and we'll let Reclamation do the modeling that they're going to do, put it in our model, and we'll go with it. Well, the problem is if Reclamation puts the wrong numbers in, then you have the wrong numbers. And not only that, based on that, we're all assuming that D1641 is being met when you in fact have a letter from Mr. Woodley that says specifically that they haven't met it and they won't meet it. So just to clear up the record, for our case, and it may not be relevant to her case, but it certainly is relevant to our case to show that you don't have a basis upon which to move forward.
Ms. Offenberg?
Two things. I think Mr. O'Laughlin just made my case that his case is basically not rebuttal, but a case in chief. And specifically, it does not, he hasn't made the connection between this phase one, which is for determining impacts to other legal users of water, not the delta outflow issue. And the purpose of raising the base case in our modeling, the no action versus the Cal WaterFix modeling, is to show that irrespective of how San Joaquin was modeled, if it was modeled the same, that's in both scenarios, then we're isolating the impacts of the Cal WaterFix. There's no new operation of the San Joaquin caused by the Cal WaterFix.
But that's my point. If you modeled it wrong under the no action or under Cal WaterFix, I understand that you've isolated the problem, but the problem for you, as you sit here as the determiners of fact, is going to be, let's say hypothetically, there's 50,000 acre feet less water coming in under the no action alternative than what we think. They say we meet D1641, it's not being met, and then all of a sudden you're 50,000 acre feet. Well, that changes what the South Delta looks like, that changes what salinity looks like, and that changes what outflow looks like. And then the other point about this is, I know this, we have not made this point directly because in a case in chief, because our understanding was the parties had to go forward first with putting on an affirmative case. We had hoped that DWR and Reclamation could actually model what was actually occurring in the real world. They didn't, they decided not to do that. Not my problem, their problem. And then finally, the last point on injury to legal users of water. This does go to injuries to legal users of water, because how Reclamation operates New Maloney's in regards to the modeling and the flows that are being made at Vernalis directly impacts the amount of storage in New Maloney's, and that is available for not only the CVP contractors, but for my clients, Oakdale and South San Joaquin, who may take water from that, or for my other SJTA clients who might have to make up the difference under an appropriate delta flow criteria. So if there is a delta shortfall that's occurring in the modeling, and you set, let's say, D1641 as the appropriate delta flow criteria, and it's not showing up, well, where are we going to get the water from?
All right, enough. Final comment, Ms. Offenberg, or final response before I open it up to others.
Well, I'd just like to say that the problem with a lot of that, it's not supported by evidence, and there was no case in chief for him to base a lot of that argument on. Thank you.
Mr. Herrick.
Thank you, John Herrick for South Delta Parties. First of all, I believe Mr. Laughlin's point is correct, that if the base case doesn't have the proper information, then whether or not the analyses both have the problem in them, they're not giving us reliable information. But the issue of rebuttal, I think, is clear. Mr. Lehi's testimony absolutely touched upon compliance with South Delta salinity standards. He chose to not include one of the 4 South Delta salinity standards. That doesn't, in my view, that doesn't make that untouchable for rebuttal. That's just something for somebody to point out that he lacked a complete analysis and to put on the proper information. The third thing is, as Mr. Laughlin touched upon, the notion that the modeling or operations might be meeting the standard, and that's what we're assuming will happen, standards, whatever. If it's not being done, that's perfectly relevant and rebuttal to their statements, because we don't know what's going to happen to other things when they do meet it, don't meet it, how they meet it. This is directly relevant to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson and then Ms. Meserve.
CalSPA rises to support Mr. O'Laughlin and his argument. It is very clear from the use of the models in a comparative mode that if you are comparing the CalFix alternative with a inadequate NAA that doesn't reflect what's actually happening, it is relevant to the testimony of all of the witnesses that have found no injury. It's also relevant to the fact that you are a responsible agency, and at some point will be receiving an environmental document that may not cover your responsibility, which is the finding of no injury. The allegations made by each and every witness, it seems like, from DWR and the Bureau, are that you can rely in a determination on injury of the use of the models in a comparative sense to find no injury in a circumstance in which we are not allowed to put on the evidence that the original NAA is incorrect. And so this is the only way we can get to it in this hearing.
Ms. Meserve.
OSHA Meserve for land, and I support the submittal of this particular rebuttal testimony, and in particular, just looking at DWR 61, it discusses the Vernal standard and South Delta salinity standards on pages 8 through 11, and I don't see why we would unduly narrow the discussion at this juncture.
All right, Ms. McGinnis, Ms. Offenberg.
I just wanted to respond to a couple of the arguments made just now by Mr. Herrick, Mr. Jackson, and Ms. Meserve. They stated that, there was information missing from Mr. Lehi's testimony that San Joaquin Tribs is now going to put on. And I wanted to bring the hearing officer's attention to some citations that I think are appropriate. Rebuttal is not the proper place for presenting new arguments, which is R&O Construction Company versus Rocks Pro International Group Limited. The citation is 2011 Westlaw 2923703. And a defense witness whose purpose is to contradict an expected and anticipated portion of the plaintiff's case in chief can never be considered a rebuttal witness or anything analogous to one. And that is in Morgan versus Commercial Union Assurance Companies 606 F 2nd 554.
Ms. Offenberg, final short comment.
I just want to be clear that at no time have we testified that the modeling is inappropriate or not correct, that the issue is that the model includes the base flows for Vernalis, and then instead of the pulse flow, it's 2E from the biological opinion, and then it returns to the base flow. The issue is that the pulse flow on the San Joaquin is not fully implemented. While these folks will talk about compliance, our issue is that there's no wet water behind the standard, and that's the issue we have on San Joaquin.
Enough. No, Mr. O'Loughlin, you may not add anything else. Thank you all for that input. I do, however, find that this testimony is relevant and is proper, so I am overruling your objections, Ms. Offenberg. Now, Mr. O'Loughlin, you may continue.
Yes. Mr. Steiner, we've attached as SJTA Exhibit 102 a resume for you. Is that a true and correct copy of your resume?
It is.
Thank you. And we've also attached as Exhibit 101 and SJTA 103 your rebuttal testimony and a diagram called Table 1. SJTA 103 is Table 1, D1641 Vernalis flow requirement and recorded flows. Are those true and correct copies of your testimony?
Yes, they are.
Can you, and I emphasize this word, briefly summarize your testimony?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
I was requested to review the historical operations and records of the San Joaquin River in light of the D1641 flow requirements, which I was a part of helping develop all the way back to the Bay Delta Accord, et cetera. What you have in front of you in terms of Exhibit 103 is a accounting and an illustration of the historical operation that occurred at Vernalis since 2003 through 2016. Is multi-column there, and what I've done is try to present my estimate of what the compliance with D1641 flow requirement would have been, or is or was February through June of that historical period, along with next door to it presenting to you what the actual flows recorded by USGS were at Vernalis, and essentially give you a little color coding there. Anytime you see the magenta type of highlight, you're seeing a month, an instance within a year when I consider the operation to be out of compliance with D1641. There is a period 2003 to 2009 during the April-May pulse flow period where I've highlighted it separately, and that is because by D1641 in that day we were operating to the VAMP requirements rather than the stated numbers of Table 3 in D1641 for April and May.
And during the time period from 2003 until 2009, they operated pursuant to meet the VAMP pulse flows. Is that correct?
That's correct, during the April-May period.
And just so you were clear, 2003 to 2009, the VAMP pulse flows may have been different than the D1641 April to May pulse flow requirements.
That would be correct.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Thank you. As of yesterday, I had cross-examination being requested by Mr. Herrick, Mr. Jackson with a caveat that he may not need it, depending on how well Mr. Herrick does, and Ms. Meserve. Does anyone else wish to conduct cross-examination? All right, Mr. Herrick.
Thank you, John Herrick, for South Delta Parties. I just have one or two questions, really, since this didn't, anyway. Mr. Steiner, thank you for being here. Your testimony notes that the compliance success of the state and federal projects for D1641 did not include exceedances during times of temporary urgency permit approvals, correct?
Correct.
And so whether or not those are technically a violation, that would indicate that the water quality at a certain place was not in compliance with, was not at the level that the 1641 numbers specify, correct?
Well,
whether or not operations under temporary urgency change petition constitute a violation, it's still, your testimony is that there were still times when the water quality was at a level that was not specified in D1641, correct?
Just real quick, John, so we're clear about this. His testimony is solely related to flow and not to quality. If you're equating quality, which may be EC, I just want to make sure you get your right question.
That's correct. Thank you for that. So my question deals with flow, not quality.
And what my analysis did was purely compare as though it were the requirements under D1641 in terms of flow at Vernalis, regardless if there was an overriding consideration and they operated to a different standard.
And dependent upon the flow at Vernalis, other water quality parameters may be affected downstream, correct?
Depending on the flow at Vernalis, correct, that would affect downstream water quality.
I have no further questions. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Herrick. Mr. Jackson?
Michael Jackson on behalf of CSBA parties. Mr. Steiner, in your examination of the flow compliance or the flow at Vernalis in comparison to D1641, did you take into account, or did you compare that to what the DWR and the Bureau say would be the comparison with the California WaterFix project? Did you compare likely flows under, if the project is approved, at Vernalis?
I believe what the proponents are doing are offering modeling results regarding what the flows would be at Vernalis with and without
Yes.
CWF.
Yeah.
And I guess what is your question again?
Did you make a comparison of what the likely flow regime would be at Vernalis with the CWF in place?
I have not made that analysis yet.
Thank you.
Ms. Meserve, any questions? Any redirect, Mr. O'Laughlin?
None.
At this time, do you wish to move your exhibits into the record?
Yes, I'd like to move in SJTA 101, 102, and 103, please.
All right. With no outstanding objections, those exhibits are accepted into the record. Thank you. All right, before we adjourn, let's discuss next week. We have Dr. Paulson up first, representing groups 22 and 27 with the city of Stockton and Antioch. What is the estimated cross-examination for Dr. Paulson? DWR, 1 hour. Anyone else? Ms. Meserve? 10 minutes for Ms. Meserve. Okay, so that's roughly, 5 minutes for Ms. Morris, so we'll say 2 hours for Dr. Paulson. Then we will get to the joint 19, 24, and 31. Mr. Nakatwa, never mind, and Mr. Del Piero. Cross-examination for that group. Estimate, please. DWR for 20. 10 for state water contractors. Okay. Anyone else? Okay, so we'll just make that round up to an hour. So that is roughly 3 hours. And then group 37. Ms. Desjardins is not here. Group 37 is Dr. Tom Williams and Ms. Desjardins. Anticipated cross. Okay. Anyone else? Then number 40 is Mr. Porgans. Anticipated cross for Mr. Porgans. Mr. O'Laughlin. Okay, no cross. We have then Ms. Seward, group 41, cross-examination. All right, and then we have Ms. Womack, group 43, cross? None. People, it looks like we might be done next week. In that case, anything else? Mr. Jackson, are you going to make another commentary about? Okay.
I don't know how many years I'm going to regret that. I'm just trying to replace you. The question that I have now is about SWR rebuttal. Is this the time to ask it?
We are still considering the request that Ms. Meserve, I guess, initiated, that I believe at the time Mr. Berliner either joined in or did not object to, the idea of having some time between the end of rebuttal and the beginning of SWR rebuttal. We are considering it, we'll be discussing it and letting you know next week. So if you have anything you wish to add on that for our consideration, now would be the time.
Okay. The dates of the 30th and you canceled the 31st. Thank you very much for doing that. I just wanted to make sure that I could be gone on the 30th if we're going to go on that date.
Actually is an excellent point, given that I believe we will be done next week. I don't think the 30th would be an issue, but since we have canceled the 31st and May 29th is a holiday, I'm looking to my co-hearing officer here, but I propose we also at this point cancel the May 30th hearing date. If we, for whatever reason, we do not finish next week, then we would reconvene on June 1st. Would that be okay with you? Mr. Jackson, you've just earned, I think, everyone's gratitude for that request. So let me.
I'm going home now.
Yes, leave for your head. We are canceling the Tuesday, May 30th WaterFix hearing date.
Thank
Ms.
you,
Nichol,
Meredith
I don't
Nichol.
think you can top what Mr. Jackson did.
You're probably right, but I'm going to try anyway. I'm here today on behalf of the entire Group 7 Sacramento Valley Water User Group. I know I change my hats every time I see you, so making that clear. And sorry? That's right. And we did want to make a request on the issue of SIR rebuttal.
Okay.
As we saw, the petitioner's SIR rebuttal was quite technical in nature and also quite lengthy. And so
I'm sorry, petitioner's SIR rebuttal?
The rebuttal.
Rebuttal, yes.
To which SIR rebuttal would be responding.
Yes.
So
wow, you've seen their SIR rebuttal already?
No, thank you. No, the rebuttal. I wish. So we wanted to request that and join Ms. Meserve's request that there be an opportunity to submit written SIR rebuttal evidence prior to the hearing on that SIR rebuttal evidence. And we would
I'm sorry, let me make sure I understand. You are requesting then staggered deadline. You want to be able to respond to, that's...
I actually have some dates for you, so let me try to outline it. What we're requesting is that that the parties be afforded the opportunity to simultaneously submit written SIR rebuttal on June 22nd.
All parties.
All parties.
Okay.
And that the hearing to orally present that written SIR rebuttal testimony would commence on July 11th. And we think that in light of the highly technical nature of some of the operations and modeling rebuttal testimony that was offered by petitioners, that we expect our SIR rebuttal evidence to also be highly technical, which would be best presented in writing so that folks can have an opportunity to review it and avoid surprises during the oral hearing. We also think that allowing the additional time and giving parties the opportunity to put some thought into preparing that would clarify some of the technical issues that were presented in rebuttal.
All right. Any comments, objections, concern to that request? Any concurrence? I see concurrence from the department. No, concurrence. Objection, okay. I thought it was too good to be true. Ms. Meserve.
Good morning. Just to add a little bit more detail to what we've just heard, I did look, it's basically, I'm predicting it will take about 14 days by the time we finish to have gotten through this part of the hearing, the rebuttal. So I don't think that, SIR rebuttal shouldn't take any more than that. I think it should take less, I would think. And we have about 27 hearing dates left. So in general, I agree with what Ms. Nichol has proposed in terms of having a date certain. And then I believe we would still be able to finish early. I heard in a conference with the petitioners that, folks were interested in seeing if a certain portion of the summer might be freed. But, my concern is having the space after the conclusion of rebuttal to work on preparing the testimony. As to whether the testimony is written or not, I actually and had clarified in my discussion when I was up there and Mr. Berliner was there that I don't necessarily have a request to submit written SIR rebuttal. That wasn't necessarily part of my request. I do think that at the very least that written supporting references may be necessary and appropriate, but I don't have an opinion as to whether the testimony itself should be in writing. So in general, I support the guideline provided, the timeline provided by Ms. Nichol, although I was going to suggest mid-June in order to leave more cushion on the back end to make sure that we could finish with SIR rebuttal.
All right, Ms. Tabor? Is the microphone on?
Kelly Tabor for the City of Stockton. The city strongly supports the requests both for some period of time between the conclusion of rebuttal and the presentation of SIR rebuttal testimony and the opportunity to present SIR rebuttal testimony in writing. Stockton is in a somewhat unique situation because extensive written rebuttal testimony was submitted, including multiple expert reports that relate to the issues that Stockton has raised that weren't raised in the petitioner's case in chief. And this due process really requires that Stockton have an opportunity to respond appropriately to that extensive technical information, and it would be very difficult to do so verbally without the benefit of a written report. So we would support, and the timing is that's been proposed by Sac Valley water users would be acceptable to the city as well. But most importantly, we think that some interval between the conclusion next week of this and the deadline for written rebuttal is necessary and appropriate. So, thank you.
Ms. Womack?
This is an on-sir rebuttal. I'm for Mr. Oshid. Sorry. I'd like to have my father attend the hearing, and so are we thinking Tuesday late or Wednesday?
Oh, you're not talking about Surrey, but you're talking
no,
about
I'm
your
not.
rebuttal.
I'm sorry, just about my rebuttal. So, as far as
I'll tell you what, since we have Dr. Paulson wrapping up in about 2 hours, let me say that we'll get to you Tuesday afternoon.
Tuesday afternoon. Okay, great.
Okay.
And so if we could have, thank you so much.
Unless there's any objections, right? Oh, hold on.
Just to clarify, are you suggesting that Ms. Womack's case or her rebuttal would go prior to Group 31's?
Let's see.
I believe that would be acceptable. I'm just trying to plan for our out-of-town witnesses.
My estimate of Dr. Paulson was about to 9:30. So how much time do you think you need, Ms. Womack? Because there's no cross-examination, so it's just the presentation. 15 minutes? You know what? In that case, we actually, I'm sorry?
Right before lunch?
Right before lunch, yes.
Awesome, and that's great for my dad.
Okay. Well, that works out. Then we'll do Dr. Paulson, then we'll do Ms. Womack, and then we will get to Group 19, 24, and 31. All right. Now we get DWR's perspective.
Just a word of caution on the Dr. Paulson because there might be redirect and then recross. So before you pick a time certain for Ms. Womack, we might want to leave a little fudge room in there. Just
If necessary, we'll take 15 minutes for Ms. Womack in between the direct and redirect.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's totally fine with us. Tom Berliner, on behalf of the Department of Water Resources, we are concerned about such a long break. The parties have had a month. There's no surprises as to what's coming in. We have very little testimony to go. There'll be some very technical testimony from Dr. Paulson next week, but we know we have everybody's testimony in advance. Parties could be working on their SIR rebuttal right now. I know we are. There's no reason why the others shouldn't be, and I suspect that they are. So to then give another month is essentially a 2-month extension, which seems excessive. We would propose a shorter break than that. And in that regard, we do agree that it would be useful to have a simultaneous exchange of something in writing, but to go to the length of actual written testimony, we were thinking is kind of burdensome, and that if parties were going to do PowerPoint, which seems to be kind of the norm, or just even if it's not PowerPoint, but just have some graphics or whatever to support their testimony, that they would just submit that, and that would be sufficient so that we would know the nature of what the testimony is, rather than going to extensive formatted written testimony, which seems to be a bit much. After all, as one of the parties noted, this is SIR rebuttal, so the breadth of this is much narrower and should be much more on target with very specific issues as we've been narrowing through each phase. Given that we're going to have a pretty short remainder to this part, our thought is that there's no reason why we wouldn't be ready to go on June 8th.
And by that, you mean the presentation of SIR rebuttal?
Correct. And we would propose an exchange of PowerPoints or whatever parties choose to exchange. I mean, if they want to do written, that's fine, that's up to them. They can certainly do more, but we would sort of suggest some, if they're going to use something, that whatever they use would be made available. And that would be scheduled for a few days ahead of that, perhaps June 2nd or June 1st. June 1st would be a week. Something right in that time frame.
Ms. McGinnis?
To summarize in order what Mr. Berliner just said, if we finish by next Friday with rebuttal and cross of rebuttal, then we could have until June 1st, which is about a week, for the parties to prepare whatever they're going to prepare for surrebuttal. And then the hearing on surrebuttal could commence on June 8th, and that's what DWR thinks is reasonable.
All right. I see Ms. Nichols standing up.
Thank you. If I could just respond on a couple of points. Mr. Berliner mentioned the time period in which the parties would have to prepare the rebuttal, and I just want to point out a couple of things about petitioner's rebuttal case that was presented in March. They submitted more than double the pages of written testimony that we saw in their case in chief. They also presented 3 new witnesses that were not part of their case in chief that the protestants now have to respond to. Also, petitioners had 4 months from the close of the case in chief of the protestants to prepare and submit full written rebuttal testimony. And to deny the protestants a similar opportunity to do that would deny some due process to those protestants to respond to this new evidence that was submitted by DWR and Reclamation in the rebuttal phase. And so what we're asking for is essentially what will amount to about 6 weeks from the close of petitioner's rebuttal case to submit written surrebuttal. And that seems quite fair and reasonable to us as the responding parties. Thank you.
Do you have any comment on the suggestion that a full-scale written submission is not necessary?
I appreciate the suggestion, and we are working on our surrebuttal, of course, and I just don't know yet if that will allow us the opportunity to fully clarify some of the issues, while we are certainly striving to be as concise and on point as possible so as to minimize unnecessary paper. I'm not certain that a PowerPoint will cut it or an outline form. We may need to also submit some concise written testimony to help clarify some of the complicated technical issues.
Ms. Meserve, and then I think I saw Ms. Tabor also coming up.
Yes, I would just add that I do think it's going to be important, and it could be done at the time of presentation, that we will have additional reference materials to submit. And so I just want to ensure that that can be submitted.
Of course. Ms. Tabor? And then I'll allow DWR to have some final comments, and I'm going to close this.
Would support the some short time period in advance of the start of the hearing. So if you were to make the surrebuttal testimony due in the middle of June and the hearing to start the following week, that would be fine for the City of Stockton. But again, as Ms. Nickel pointed out, some parties are forced to respond to a substantial amount of rebuttal testimony under a very tight time frame in which their experts are also preparing to present rebuttal and needing to monitor the course of this hearing to, we hope, identify and narrow the issues that would be addressed in surrebuttal. So it's been difficult to work on the testimony and participate actively in the hearing, and therefore some additional time we think is necessary. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Ms. Morris?
One comment, if the board does allow such a long amount of time after it, then I would agree that written submittals would be appropriate because it gives people, I mean, the whole idea of rebuttal is it goes immediately after and everybody's kind of going and it's the same amount of time and amount of preparation, whereas if we're allowing a longer period, I think it would be helpful to have it in writing because it might be potentially a large amount of information all at once. So that's my only comment.
All right. Any final thoughts, Mr. Berliner or Ms. McGinnis?
Just briefly, we weren't suggesting that a party should be constrained in what they want to submit. So if we are going to start on the June 8th date, if that's acceptable and a party wants to submit written, I think that's perfectly fine. We weren't considered, but we just thought there ought to be some at least minimum threshold where you would be required to at least inform the other parties of the nature. And a PowerPoint seemed to be a convenient way to do it. If somebody wanted to submit more, that would certainly be fine. And we would concur with the state water contractors that if we are going to have a lengthy period of time, that it should be in writing and should be exchanged simultaneously, but we don't support the lengthy delay. We would prefer to start sooner rather than later.
And just to continue on the point of starting sooner rather than later and not having a lengthy delay, I was just looking for when, rebuttal exhibits were due. I believe it was March 23rd, which was, I'm losing track of days, but I think like 2 months ago. So, and we've been going through the rebuttal testimony, obviously, and doing cross-exam. And, it seems rebuttal is supposed to be limited to this rebuttal phase. So I just, DWR does not think that a lengthy delay is necessary.
Oh, yes. I do want to ask for an update on the ESA CEQA process.
I know that it's moving along, but I don't have any certain dates to give right now. I can check and
provide that information next week.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do you mean the biological opinion? Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you all. Ms. Nickel.
I think it would also be helpful to have an update from DWR and Reclamation on the certification of the final EIR in addition to the biological opinion.
All right. Next week. With that, thank you all for your input. We'll take it under advisement. We'll reconvene on Tuesday at 9:30 in, this room. All right. Thank you.